All right, let's jump into a deep dive today on drug development. Specifically, how scientists go about figuring out the safest and most effective dose for new medications.
Okay, yeah.
We're going to be looking at a process called dose escalation and how it's used to determine the maximum tolerated dose, or MTD.
It's a pretty fascinating process, really. You start with a new drug, holds so much promise, right? But you have to figure out how much of it the body can actually handle before it starts causing problems.
So it's like walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to find that sweet spot where it's doing its job but not causing any unacceptable side effects.
Yeah, exactly. You're trying to find that therapeutic window,
Yeah.
the range where the drug is effective but also safe. And dose escalation is kind of like the map researchers use to navigate that uncharted territory.
Okay, so let's unpack this map. Dose escalation, if I understand it correctly, it involves testing the drug on like groups of patients, right?
Yeah.
Carefully increasing the dose as you go.
You got it. Those groups are called cohorts. They're really at the heart of these dose escalation studies. Researchers start by giving a small group of patients a low dose of the drug, and then they monitor them super closely, like watching for any adverse effects.
And if everything looks good, then they move on to the next cohort, up the dose a little bit.
Yeah, precisely. But it's not just a simple matter of everything looks good. There are specific decision criteria that researchers have to follow before they can bump it up to that higher dose. These criteria take into account things like the severity and frequency of side effects in the previous cohort.
So it's not just like, is there a side effect, but how bad is it and how many people are experiencing it?
Exactly. How common is it in that cohort? For example, like if a mild headache is reported by just one person, it might not be a huge deal. But if several people in that group experience like severe nausea, that's a red flag. Researchers are going to have to investigate further.
Makes sense. So they keep inching up the dosage cohort by cohort, watching out for those red flags. But how do they know when to stop when they've reached the MTD?
That's where things get even more interesting. The MTD, it's not always about the highest dose the drug can possibly go. It's the highest dose that patients can tolerate without experiencing what we call dose-limiting toxicities, or DLTs. These DLTs are like predefined side effects that are serious enough to warrant stopping the dose escalation.
So it's not about finding the maximum the body can handle, period. It's about finding the maximum the body can handle before those serious side effects outweigh the benefits of the drug.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act. And that's why this whole process is so meticulous and carefully regulated. Organizations like the FDA and the ICH have very strict guidelines in place to ensure patient safety during these dose escalation studies.
I bet there's a ton of paperwork involved. But I'm guessing those regulations are there for a reason. They provide a framework for conducting these studies ethically and responsibly.
Absolutely. They set the standards for everything, like how quickly the dose can be escalated to what criteria have to be met before a study can be stopped. And it's not just about protecting the patients in that specific study, but also ensuring that the data collected is reliable, so can be used to make informed decisions about the drug's development going forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to rush the process and risk overlooking important safety signals.
Precisely. And that's why those real-world case studies are so valuable. They give us concrete examples of how these principles play out in practice. Highlight the complexities that researchers often face. For example, take the case of romidepsin, an anti-cancer drug used to treat certain types of lymphoma.
Oh yeah, I've heard of romidepsin. Tell me more about that.
Well, early studies showed that this drug was very potent against cancer cells, but it also came with some pretty serious safety concerns, particularly at higher doses. Researchers knew they had to carefully navigate the dose escalation process to find that sweet spot between its effectiveness and its safety.
So how did they approach this? What did their dose escalation strategy look like?
They designed a series of studies specifically in patients with a type of lymphoma called cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, or CTCL. They started with a very low dose and very carefully monitored the patients for any signs of toxicity. Their main concern was blood-related toxicities, particularly a condition called thrombocytopenia. It's a low platelet count.
Oh, that sounds pretty serious. So what did they observe as they gradually increased the dose? Did the frequency or severity of these toxicities increase?
Yeah, as they upped the dose, they did see an increase in those blood-related side effects, which was expected. But they also started to see some really promising results in terms of how well the drug was working against the cancer. It was a classic example of that balancing act we were talking about earlier.
Walking that tightrope, trying to push the dose high enough to be effective against the cancer, but not so high that the side effects became too dangerous.
Precisely. And they did eventually find that optimal dose, the MTD, that struck a balance between efficacy and safety. Based on those findings, romidepsin was eventually approved for the treatment of CTCL. It was a great example of how careful dose escalation can lead to the development of a truly valuable treatment.
That's a great story. It really highlights how much goes into something as seemingly simple as finding the right dose. It's not just picking a number out of a hat. It's a whole science in itself.
Absolutely. And it's a science that's constantly evolving.
Speaking of evolving,
Yeah.
I understand AI is starting to play a role in drug development.
Yeah.
I'm curious, how's this cutting-edge technology impacting the world of dose escalation?
That's a great question. AI and machine learning, they're being used to analyze just massive amounts of data from preclinical studies and clinical trials. They can help to identify potential safety signals early on, predict how a drug might behave at different doses, and even suggest optimal dosing regimens.
So AI is like having a superpowered research assistant, helping us make sense of all the data and spot patterns that we might otherwise miss.
That's a great way to put it. The potential is huge. AI could help us design safer and more efficient dose escalation studies, reduce the number of patients exposed to potentially toxic doses, and ultimately accelerate the development of new and life-saving medications.
That's amazing. It sounds like AI could really revolutionize the way we approach dose escalation,
Uh-huh.
but I imagine there are some challenges too.
Of course, one of the biggest challenges is ensuring the quality and reliability of the data that AI algorithms are trained on. If the data is biased or incomplete, the AI's recommendations could be misleading or even dangerous.
So it's not just about having the technology, but using it responsibly, making sure it's working with good data.
Exactly. That's why human oversight is still crucial. AI can be a really powerful tool, but it's only as good as the data it's given and the people who interpret its results.
It's a good reminder that even with all these advances, we can't forget the human element in all of this.
Absolutely. Ultimately, it's all about finding the best way to use these tools to improve patient care and develop safer and more effective treatments.
Well said. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about some of these success stories that have come out of dose escalation studies. I came across a fascinating case involving a drug called imatinib, also known as Gleevec.
Imatinib, a groundbreaking treatment for chronic myeloid leukemia, or CML.
That's right, CML. It's a type of cancer that affects the blood and bone marrow. And before imatinib, the prognosis for patients was pretty grim.
You're right, imatinib truly changed the landscape for CML treatment.
So how did dose escalation studies contribute to its development?
Well, early studies in the 1990s showed that imatinib was very effective at targeting the specific protein that drives the growth of CML cells. But, like with any new drug, researchers needed to figure out the optimal dose. They conducted a series of dose escalation studies in CML patients, starting with a relatively low dose and gradually increasing it.
Okay. What were the results of those studies? Did they find that higher doses were more effective?
They discovered that higher doses of imatinib were associated with higher rates of complete cytogenetic response, meaning that the cancer cells were no longer detectable in the bone marrow. It was a remarkable finding.
Wow, that's incredible.
Mhm.
But I imagine, as with any potent drug, higher doses also meant a greater risk of side effects.
Yeah, there's always that risk-benefit trade-off to consider. But what was really remarkable about imatinib was that it was generally well tolerated, even at those higher doses that proved to be so effective.
So it's both highly effective and relatively safe. That's a rare and powerful combination.
It is indeed. And that's what made imatinib such a breakthrough in CML treatment. This case really highlights how crucial dose escalation studies are in helping us unlock the full potential of new drugs.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how carefully exploring different dose levels can lead to such incredible breakthroughs in treatment.
Absolutely. By meticulously adjusting the dosage and carefully observing the effects, researchers can identify that optimal dose that maximizes efficacy while minimizing risk. It's truly a testament to the power of scientific rigor and the importance of a patient-centered approach to drug development.
It's fascinating. This whole process of dose escalation really kind of mirrors the scientific method itself.
Uh-huh.
You start with this hypothesis, a safe starting dose.
Mm-hmm.
You gather data, you analyze it, and then you refine that hypothesis based on what you learn.
Yeah.
It's a continuous cycle of observation, experimentation, and adjustment.
Precisely, yeah. It's like you're exploring a new landscape. We start with the very cautious first step, see how the terrain responds, and then, adjust our path accordingly. With each dose level, we get a clearer picture of the drug's effects and its safety profile.
So it's not just about, looking for that MTD, but also trying to uncover how the drug interacts with the body at all these different levels.
Absolutely, yeah. For instance, we might look for patterns in the side effects. Do they only show up at higher doses? Are they related to how the drug works at the molecular level? These clues are essential for understanding the drug's potential risks and benefits.
So it's about seeing that bigger picture, understanding the drug's full story, not just getting fixated on a single data point.
Exactly. It's like, getting to know a person. It takes time, careful observation, and a little bit of detective work to really understand all those nuances and complexities. And speaking of detective work, you mentioned earlier that AI is starting to play a role in all of this.
Right. It seems like AI could be such a powerful tool in this whole process. So how is it impacting dose escalation studies specifically?
Well, AI and machine learning, they're being used to analyze just huge amounts of data from those preclinical studies and clinical trials. These algorithms can help to identify potential safety signals very early on, maybe even before they become apparent in human trials. They can also help predict how a drug might behave at different doses and even suggest the optimal dosing regimens.
So it's almost like AI is a crystal ball, helping researchers anticipate these potential issues and make more informed decisions about dosage.
Yeah, in a way, yes. It's like having a super powered research assistant who can sift through mountains of data and really pinpoint the most relevant information. AI has the potential to make dose escalation studies safer, more efficient, and ultimately help get those new treatments to patients faster.
That's incredible, but I'm sure there are challenges, and ethical considerations when we're using AI in this way.
You're absolutely right. One of the biggest challenges is making sure that the data that's used to train these AI algorithms is actually high quality. If that data is flawed or incomplete, the AI's recommendations could be inaccurate or even dangerous. So data integrity is really paramount.
It's a good reminder that AI is a tool, right? And like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
Yeah.
It's up to us to make sure that it's being used responsibly and ethically.
Absolutely. We need to be mindful of potential biases that can creep into these AI algorithms and make sure that human oversight remains a critical part of this process. AI can augment our decision making, but it shouldn't replace human judgment altogether.
Well said. Well, let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the success stories that have come out of these dose escalation studies. You mentioned imatinib earlier, which has been such a game changer for CML treatment. Could you tell us a little more about its development?
Sure, of course. Before imatinib, CML was often a death sentence. But, early studies in the 1990s showed that this drug had a remarkable ability to target the specific protein that drives the growth of those CML cells. Researchers knew they had something special on their hands, but they needed to figure out what the right dose was.
So they embarked on a series of these dose escalation studies, carefully testing different dosage levels in CML patients. What did those studies reveal?
Well, what they found was that higher doses of imatinib led to higher rates of what we call complete cytogenetic response, meaning that the cancer cells were no longer detectable in the bone marrow. It was a huge breakthrough, offered new hope for patients with CML.
That's fantastic. But as we've been discussing, those higher doses often come with a greater risk of side effects. Was that the case with imatinib?
Well, what was so remarkable about imatinib was that it was generally well tolerated even at the higher doses that proved to be so effective. It was really this rare combination of efficacy and safety, which ultimately led to its, widespread adoption as a standard treatment for CML.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of how those dose escalation studies can lead to the development of really life-saving treatments. It highlights the importance of this meticulous process in unlocking the full potential of new drugs.
Absolutely. The imatinib story, it's really a testament to the dedication of researchers and the power of those carefully controlled dose escalation studies. It's a reminder that progress in medicine often comes through, these incremental steps, careful observation, and a willingness to learn from both successes and setbacks.
As we've been talking about dose escalation, it's interesting how it's not just about numbers and data points, but really about people.
Yeah, that's such an important point. Behind every data point in these trials is a person, with their own hopes and their anxieties, their own unique story.
It's easy to get lost in the technical details, but at the end of the day, the whole goal of this is to improve people's lives.
Absolutely, and that's really what makes this whole process so vital. It's about striking that balance between efficacy and safety to make sure new treatments are effective, but also, tolerable for the people who will be taking them.
It's a balancing act with really high stakes, especially when we're talking about these life-threatening conditions like
Oh,
cancer.
or for sure. In those situations, patients might be willing to accept a higher level of risk if it means a chance at a longer life.
But it's still a huge decision. How do researchers and clinicians even begin to navigate those conversations with patients about the risks and benefits of dose escalation?
Well, I think open and honest communication is so important. Patients need to be fully informed about the potential side effects at different dose levels so they can make an educated choice about their treatment.
It's about empowering patients to be active participants in their care and not just passive recipients.
Exactly. It's a partnership, you know,
Yeah.
between the patient, the clinician, and the researchers, all working together to find the best path forward.
Now I'm curious, are there any special considerations when it comes to dose escalation for different patient populations?
Yeah.
Like, for example, children or older adults?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Age is definitely a factor that can influence drug dosing. You know, for example, children often metabolize drugs differently than adults do. Their organs might not be fully developed, which can really impact how a drug is absorbed, distributed, and eliminated from their bodies.
So you're not just giving them a smaller version of the adult dose.
No, not at all. It's much more complex than that, and it really highlights the need for age-specific research in clinical trials.
What about older adults? Are there unique considerations for them too?
Well, you know, as we age, our organs tend to function a little bit less efficiently, and we might be more susceptible to certain side effects. So dose adjustments are often necessary for older patients just to ensure their safety.
It seems like personalized medicine, tailoring those treatments to a person's specific characteristics becomes even more important when we consider these age-related factors.
Oh, absolutely. We're really moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach to medicine and recognizing that what works for one person might not work for another, even if they have the same condition.
That's a really fascinating glimpse into the future of medicine. So as we wrap up our deep dive into dose escalation, what key takeaway would you leave our listeners with today?
Hmm. I'd say this. The next time you take a medication, really think about the incredible amount of research and careful consideration that went into determining the right dose for you. It's a process that continues even after a drug is approved, as researchers continue to monitor its safety and efficacy and make adjustments based on any new data that comes up.
It's amazing. It's a real testament to that ongoing quest for better treatments and the dedication of all the people working so hard to ensure that these medications are both effective and safe.
Yeah, well said. It's a really dynamic field. It's constantly evolving, and I, for one, am excited to see what the future holds.
And on that note, we'll conclude our deep dive today into the world of dose escalation. Thanks for joining us.